I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, No, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost A dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radioed my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch. and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement. Anywhere that I went had a resident complaining of water running all night.